Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amira, and on behalf of Pathfinder Foundation, I welcome you to this webinar on providing science advice to governments, lessons from a pandemic. Since the breakout of the pandemic for us, really beginning of last year in Jan, the foundation has done a couple of discussions on various aspects of COVID-19. Earlier last year in May, we, in collaboration with some of our Chinese partners, we had a discussion on the experiences that we had shared thus far. Then later in the month, we translated a well-recognized COVID-19 manual, an English manual to Sinhala and Tamil, our national languages, and distributed it in schools and universities. And earlier this year in February, we had a discussion with the International Relations Department of the Ministry of Health in Israel, and we spoke of their successful vaccination rollout. Now today, I know there is a sense of fatigue when it comes to the topic of COVID. Not only are we inundated with such a lot of information about it, but it has become very much a part of our daily reality, and not a very nice reality to that. And especially now in Sri Lanka, and I think across the world, as we grapple with the Delta variant, it's wherever we look, that it seems to be there. But today's discussion, what we hope from Pathfinder by bringing together two independent experts like Professor Mandel and Jai Singha, is to not just focus on the pandemic, but to perhaps take a broader view of science and the role that science now seems to be playing in decision making, in policy making, and in giving advice to the governments. We would hopefully, as the discussion progresses, we would, if you do have questions, we would like to take it up towards the latter end of the discussion. So you can always post it on our chat box. We are also joined today with senior representatives from the National Science Foundation, the National Science and Technology Commission, the National Academy of Science in Sri Lanka, and hopefully the Sri Lanka Association for the Advancement of Science as well. Now, with those introductory comments, I will hand over the meeting to Dr. Jai Singha, who has supported us a lot when it comes to this particular topic. He's an emeritus professor of medicine from the University of Colombo, and currently works as a consultant to the Department of Medicine at the Sabaragamuwa University here in Sri Lanka. He's a consultant physician in the private sector, and he has been involved in policy advice since the early 90s, where he initially worked with the National Development Council, the Presidential Task Force on Health, and more recently on issues related to COVID. And very pertinently to this particular discussion, he's also a very strong advocate to develop a more structured approach to science advice in Sri Lanka. So over to you, Professor Jai Singha.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Good morning to you, especially to Professor Carol Mandel, who's joining us from UK. Hi, Carol. Let me begin by introducing Carol to the audience, and then we will get on to a few questions and carry on the conversation. Now, Professor Carol Mandel is the Chief International Science Envoy of the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, and she was appointed in January 2021. Previously, she was the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. She is the Professor of Extragalactic Astronomy at the University of Bath, where she holds the Hiroko Sherwin Chair in Extragalactic Astronomy, and is a fellow of the prestigious Institute of Physics. So I would like to start with a personal note. Firstly, by way of introduction, how would a scientist who is interested in extragalactic astronomy or astronomy of space beyond the Milky Way become a science advisor? Would you like to set the ball rolling,
Yeah, thank you, and it's a great pleasure to join you in conversation today, and thank you for the opportunity. So it was quite a change in my career. I was approached about the position, and we'll talk a little bit more about the science advice mechanisms in government in the UK through our conversation. But there's been a long-standing network of chief scientific advisors across Whitehall, and we are led by the government chief scientific advisor, currently Sir Patrick Vallance, who advises the Prime Minister. And each chief scientific advisor, of course, works across a very broad scientific remit. Within each department, they have a particular focus. So if they're in the Department for Health, they may have a health focus. In my case, of course, I've always worked internationally. So as an astrophysicist, as a physicist, I have collaborators around the world. The facilities that we develop and we build and we use on the ground or in space to do our cutting edge science at the frontiers of knowledge in physics really are too big for one nation to build alone. And so the theme throughout my career has been international collaboration and cooperation. And so with that lens, of course, the Chief Scientific Advisor role within the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office now was an ideal role. I'd always, I guess, as I'd gone through my career and become more senior, I'd started to work at that international policy level, particularly from the academic side, grant-giving bodies, working, for example, with the European Research Council to allocate funding to world-leading scientists from around the world. So I had a lens of international collaboration and also policy development within my field of physics, and then moving towards the technology side, because obviously I'm a technologist as well. So when I was approached about the Foreign Office role, it seemed exciting, it seemed intriguing. I was not fully aware of the departmental Chief Scientific Advisor roles. And also it was a very stereotypical, classical, older white male scientist role. And so I was really proud to be appointed as the first woman Chief Scientific Advisor in the Foreign Ministry as well. And since then, of course, my portfolio has covered a wide range of areas. And the bottom line really is bringing the scientific method to challenge policy-making assumptions, to make sure that the best scientific evidence is drawn from the most robust sources, and really understanding how science is done, what makes robust science, and how one can challenge beyond one's subject matter expertise. Because obviously we all have subject matter expertise, but how we use that to work across disciplines is also a really interesting area, and of course particularly relevant in COVID.
Oh, thank you very much. That's fascinating. Let's now change gear to some extent and come back closer to the Milky Way, as it were. Well, you see, from a practical point of view, we see science advice as advisory councils, advisory committees, national academies, or chief scientific officers, and what you mentioned about departments having advisors. Sri Lanka has presidential task forces and so on. Now, my first question is, what's the historical development of science advice in the UK? How did it come to this level? Yeah.
So it's long-standing, really. I mean, the role of government chief scientific advisor dates back almost to the beginning of the 20th century, and science advisors were particularly important through the Second World War, and really in at the heart of government. And since then, of course, the systems have evolved. We have quite a robust science advice mechanism that is wide-reaching. So first of all, we have the chief scientific advisors, one in each department, and a couple of the big departments will have subsidiary CSAs as well. And we form a network across Whitehall. We meet on a weekly basis, and we're, as I say, led by Sir Patrick Vallance. Sir Patrick is the government chief scientific advisor, so he advises the Prime Minister on everything to do with science technology, be that in emergencies or be that for strategic reasons. And he really pulls that network together. As I say, we each have our own department-focused science advice work, making sure that we have the right kind of science advice mechanisms within each department. And then we also work across Whitehall as CSAs and with relevant officials. And we then reach out into the science ecosystem, both nationally and internationally. We're all leading scientists and innovators in our own right. We have our networks, and we have obviously the reputations within those networks, and we draw on those for our daily work. On top of that, we have obviously the Parliamentary Select Committee system, which is really the parliamentary mechanism for making sure that we have the right scrutiny and challenge to government. There is a Science and Technology Select Committee that focuses on science and technology. There's also a Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which of course is the committee that's most involved with my department. And they then, of course, interweave with one another. And there are other select committees. We also have the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, which is a fantastic little unit, which I think is 20 or 21 years old now. I think they had their anniversary last year. And what they do is a really, really interesting thing where they will take policy issues of the day and they will do very deep and broad peer review on a particular scientific issue. And they will produce what they call a post note. And these were traditionally small leaflets that were outside in the Palace of Westminster. So as busy parliamentarians who may be dealing with many, many policy issues in a particular day, they could walk past the stand and they could pick up that science advice note, very deeply peer reviewed, but written in a very accessible way for busy parliamentarians. So it has the robustness, it has the integrity, it has the real quality of science advice, but it written in a very accessible way. These are all available online, so these are publicly available. And so all of those pieces together all complement one another. And it means that, you know, in normal times when we're developing science strategy, when we're working with funding bodies and learned academies across the country and internationally, we have those very robust, stable mechanisms. On top of that, there's a mechanism that Sir Patrick Vallance, as the GCSA, can trigger at times of national or international emergency or crisis, when he is required to give advice to the Prime Minister that requires complex science advice. And this is called the Science Advisory Group in Emergencies. So this is a mechanism that he can trigger. So before the COVID crisis, we had a national crisis where we'd had heavy rains. There was a dam in England that looked threatening it looked as though it was weakening and it may burst. And that would have had catastrophic impact on downstream communities. And so, of course, Patrick scrambled the SAGE mechanism to give advice to Cabinet. And that, of course, was not a crisis that I was involved in because it was a national one and my perspective is international. But of course, when we got the first news coming through from China about this new and unusual variant of a coronavirus, then that was the moment at which Sir Patrick then pulled together the SAGE team. And that was a very broad-reaching team that he put together. He decided to co-chair SAGE at that time with the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, because it was a health crisis. And he pulled together a really broad and diverse range of science advice groups, academics, clinicians, logistics teams. And that was really the beginning of our response to COVID back in January 2020.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, you have a fascinating mix of an ecosystem providing science advice. So how does it really function at a practical level? Let's say on a day-to-day basis, how would the science advisor interact within his or her department?
Yes, so the Chief Scientific Advisor, like myself and my colleagues, we are senior civil servants. So I am part-time, I'm 3 days a week on secondment to government as, certainly when I was in my role as CSA, now as International Envoy, and 2 days a week in academia. So usually the science advisors are either 3 or 4 days a week. And again, they have that extra day back in academia to make sure that they remain connected as research leading academics. We usually, it will depend on the department, we will have a team where we actually are providing or drawing in the best possible scientific evidence. We'll be working very closely with policy teams and making sure that policy development is evidence-based. And we will be challenging and advising on any of the planning assumptions that go into that policy development. And in turn, we will be then looking at some of those policy objectives and looking to see where we can help with science advice if it doesn't already sit there. In my particular case internationally, of course, my focus is particularly around science diplomacy and looking across the international piece. And so we have a network of about 100 science and innovation attaches that I lead from London, and they're embedded in embassies around the world. And they are really building up the stakeholder relationships in country, supporting our ambassadors in country to build up those relationships so that we're not just looking nationally, but we're connected internationally with the international science and innovation ecosystem. This then helps us when we're building friendships, we're building collaborations, we can support our universities to build new partnerships in regions, and also it helps us to work with countries both to advise and support other countries and also to draw in learning from other countries, particularly at times of crisis as we've seen for COVID.
Yeah. So, I mean, on a day-to-day basis, do the policymakers ask the scientists, what are your comments on a particular policy, or how does it work?
So it can be. So we have a science mechanism within each department. It will depend on the piece of work. So we might be actually doing science research within the department. We may actually design a study, for example, and we have some very clear, transparent, open protocols for doing that Sir Patrick has put in place. We might be drawing science advice from wider networks because a policy question has arisen. The Chief Scientific Advisor, because we are in a senior civil service role, it is a requirement on the department to make sure that policy development does have science advice and science challenge. And so we are often in very senior meetings. It's a busy role. And so we will be working very closely with our senior civil service colleagues as they're developing policy and as they're developing departmental objectives. Some groups, of course, some CSAs will have science advisory groups. They will be external at science advisory groups that we put together with leading scientists and academics and industrial experts, so that we can actually sometimes go to those science advisory groups and say, this is the kind of policy challenges that we have coming. We would like to draw your input on this, or we would like to draw in data sets, or we'd like to draw in evidence to help to inform our early thinking. And then, of course, as we're developing our policy pieces, we will always be going back, challenging our underlying assumptions. Has anything changed? Do we need to draw new data? Do the data exist, for example? Are we working at the frontiers of scientific knowledge? And if so, what do we need to do in order to advance our knowledge so that we can make sure that our policy development is current? And then, of course, currently we're going through our spending review round, where Her Majesty's Treasury will decide on the public funding for the whole of the nation across all sorts of different pieces that government leads on. And of course, we're making sure that our science and technology ecosystem within the UK remains world leading, that funding is objectively allocated, and that it delivers to the government's priorities in a robust way.
To get into a few more details, so let's say there is a Department of Health or one of the other departments, highways or whatever, and there's a scientist there. So when the policy is being developed, do you really ask them? They're part of the process, but do you ask them to produce some scientific reports, or how does it really happen at the ground level?
Yeah, so it can be. It can be actually the science advisor who will bring in an issue. I mean, for example, if you think about, climate change and decarbonising transport, for example, obviously the Chief Scientific Advisor in the Department for Transport is working very closely with their networks, but also the Chief Scientific Advisor in the Department for Business, Energy and Innovation, because we're looking at bringing, hydrogen, for example, into our energy supply lines. And so it's actually bringing that whole ecosystem together. It might be a policy paper, it may be a big report that we pull together over a slower timescale, where we'll all work together as Chief Scientific Advisors, and we'll add our expertise. We may be drawing from our international networks. For example, I can go to the Science and Innovation Network and say, we're working on a paper on quantum computing, for example, and we would like to have your perspective on the current state of play in the country in which you're based, and we may bring that into the report. And so there's quite a lot of iteration sometimes on those reports, but again, that challenging that we have the cutting edge knowledge in those reports, and also writing it in a way that's helpful for policy makers, because these are not academic papers. And I think the communication piece is really important. The big difference that I've seen between work in academia and work at, a desk officer's policy work is the pace. A desk officer may be working on many issues in a particular day. They may want to advise the Foreign Secretary or the Secretary of State about a particular issue with a very, very short turnaround. There may be a question coming from parliamentarians into the department that you need to provide an answer to. And so there are very different paces, and it's about making sure that we're working on those long-term strategic pieces whilst we're also doing the responsive work in a very different way to an academic might think about doing their fundamental research work.
Yeah. So y'all seconded from academia, and I understand that's done partly to ensure that your independence is there. So you have this network of science advisors in the different departments. Now, how do you engage with the scientists in the UK? What's the sort of mechanism you have?
So we have a range of mechanisms. There are formal mechanisms, there are informal mechanisms. The formal mechanisms, I think, again, have been brought very much to the fore in the COVID crisis. And so with the Science Advisory Group in Emergencies, we have a number of sub-working groups that will draw together a whole wide range of different experts to work together, be that the Environmental Monitoring Group or NERVTAG or the Psychology and Behaviours Group. And so bringing the right kinds of experts together, again, quite a broad mix of disciplinarians, but bringing those together to work on a particular policy challenge, and then feeding back into the main SAGE group where we can take those consensus views and produce the right kinds of reports for our policy teams. We also work very closely, obviously, with the National Academies, so the Royal Society, the British Academy, the Royal Academy of Engineering. That gives us a very scaled up access into professional and learned communities across the science and engineering base. And it means that we have some real scale when we're pulling in advice or expertise, or actually putting questions out to those communities as we develop policy pieces. And then, of course, I think there's our personal agency. We've all, gone through very rigorous selection processes, very competitive processes to win these positions. And so there's our own personal standing, and I think our reputation nationally and internationally in the networks that we work with. And also drawing, I think, into our university base, into our commercial base, our innovation and industrial base, because obviously different departments will have different mixtures of the kinds of communities that they work with. Obviously, the Department for International Trade, my CSA colleague there works very closely with business, both nationally and internationally. And so, we shouldn't just focus on the research and innovation ecosystem just within our academic partners, but actually we go much broader in terms of into our public services and into our industrial and commercial sector.
Right, thank you. So now we'll try to see how to reflect on the situation in Sri Lanka, because we do have science advisors appointed to the executive, but we don't have this structured way of providing science advice at the departmental level or for government. We do have task forces which bring in people at different times. So there's a presidential task force for COVID control, and that has brought in several scientists and academics, but there is no structured formal process, as it were. But let's get the views from Sri Lanka, and we have with us, I think we have Professor Priyan Das who is representing the National Academy of Sciences of Sri Lanka. Would you like to start off, Priyan? A short comment on the role of the scientists in policymaking in Sri Lanka? Or anyone from NASTEC, National Science and Technology Commission, is, I think they were, yes, Priyan. Yes, you are there, Priyan. Yes, please. We also have Professor Ranjit Senaratna. He is from the National Science Foundation. So,
right. Can I say something then? This
yes,
is Priyan.
Yes.
I had some difficulty in unmuting myself and turning on my video. Right. So we must thank our guest from the UK for giving us a very comprehensive view about the science advisory system in the UK. I think we are somewhat removed from that sort of environment here in Sri Lanka. As Professor Jayasinghe says, of course, I don't know whether we have had a science advisor formally for some time. There used to be one some time ago, a single person appointed as science advisor. And sometimes that person was seen as a sort of conduit for concerned scientists or scientific bodies like the academies, the National Research Council, the National Science Foundation, to sort of funnel information to the executive. But the way that, I think on paper, the way that the executive works is probably through the line ministries. So the line ministries, although they don't have science advisors attached to them as far as I know, it is the line ministries that are supposed to provide information and advice to the cabinet of ministers who will then take various decisions. Whether this happens in this way or whether greater emphasis is given to these ad hoc task forces, I'm not sure. And also something that maybe, I'm sorry, I am unable to recall the name of a visitor from overseas, because I think there's a different name that is indicated in your Zoom. So please forgive me.
Yeah,
there's a different name. So I'm just
Sorry,
going to
that's
call
my,
you a colleague from the UK. Yes. So one of the issues is, you know, there are two things. One is the whole selection process, because very often these science advisors and even some of the boards, the scientific boards of these science organizations, they are actually appointed by the executive. So I am not sure about, you know, I mean, that's fair enough, but I think there needs to be some, what shall I say, acceptance and credibility among the scientific community. And I'm not sure how well that happens in Sri Lanka. That's one of the things that I want to say. The second thing that I want to say is that, you know, and also in the UK, I'm sure there will be these issues, you know, situations where scientists disagree, right? I mean, you know, for example, you know, recently over this COVID issue, you know, we had an issue about burial of, you know, COVID victims. And, you know, there was scientific controversy about whether that should be allowed or not. Then more recently, we have actually a situation where it appears that, you know, one of the policies of the government is to virtually go all the way to organic fertilizer. And again, there is divided scientific opinion. In that case, I think most scientists, in my opinion, are not very happy with that. So this tension between, you know, policy set by the executive and scientific opinion, the consultation of that scientific opinion, how does one consult a scientist? I mean, if there is a well-structured system like a science advisory system, then that is in place. I myself feel that for this country, you know, the executive should make greater use of the line ministries, which is also, well, maybe probably not happening as much as it should. So yeah, those are some of the issues that I would like to raise. And also, we're talking about disagreements. There are two types of disagreements. One is disagreement among scientists, right? Some time ago, there was a disagreement about a ban on glyphosate as well. And you know, there were different scientific opinions. So one is the disagreement among scientists. The other is, of course, the tension between a science view, now where COVID is concerned, actually a health view, and an economy view, right? I mean, I think the whole world is facing these issues where, you know, at the moment, even in Sri Lanka, you know, the medical fraternity is calling for a lockdown. Government is reluctant to do that because I think the economy is in not very good shape. So how those issues are resolved is also, I'm not sure. It does not seem to be happening well in Sri Lanka. Maybe we can hear some sort of ideas from the UK. Thank you. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Priyan. Anyone else? Is Professor Sirimali or Professor Ranjit or anyone from NASTEC? Is that Dr. Shami? Are you hoping to speak?
Yes, thank you very much for giving this opportunity to the panel. And first of all, I would like to brief about National Science and Technology Commission. As per this is a mandated organization, this is supposed to do the apex body mandated by government of Sri Lanka to provide science advice, especially in the areas across the sectors as per Science and Technology Development Act 94/11. So this is supposed to be need to be happened and initiated by the NASTEC. So even though, and during the last couple of years, since 2019, now we are developing a national system to do this work, to bring a national committee or a national science advice body to act as a policy broker, not a policy issue advocate. Rather than for the individual, we are developing at the moment a system. We have done so far a lot of work on these things. So this system will address these issues once it's established in the future, not in agriculture or health and natural science, whatever the sectors. So ideally, the systems, and we learn some insight, something from International Network of Government Science Advice. And we learn from them, and we trying to model from the international perspectives and the regional perspective to develop this system in Sri Lanka. this system actually will be coordinated by the NASTEC. In this system will ensure the holistic assessments with experts, with the necessary experts in the area. And it will bring all the key institutions in the Sri Lanka to under the one, one platform to make the informed decision-making policy within the robust system. So supposed to be this system will be shared, this platform will be chaired by the NASTEC and it will be properly represented by what we thought the President of National Academy of Sciences in Sri Lanka and President of Sri Lanka Association of Advancement of Science LAS and President of Social Science Association of Sri Lanka and President of Institute of Engineers and Sri Lanka Medical Association and the representative from nominated by the President's Secretary and the senior officials nominated by the respective secretaries and prime ministers. So this is the common platform. In that platform, that will be act as a government science advisory body. So this system, this committee will have empower to do all the burning issues, the timely issues, the states of NASTEC regarding the policies in the whether the issues could be the local or the national. It will be the proactively do this robust to facilitate the robust evidence gathering mechanism. So this is Professor what we are thinking and what we are doing this work, and hopefully it will be we will be within a next 6-7 months. We planning to launch the system and to get all the stakeholders to make aware of this system.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, that brings in different ways of looking at it, because we have the UK system, which has embedded scientists from academia who are within the departments. And in Sri Lanka, we seem to be moving towards a representation body. Not necessarily, I mean, we are talking of representatives of institutions being there, not necessarily the top scientists. So, and that body seems to be functioning. The plan is to function outside this process. So I see some interesting comparisons between an embedded system of academia and another system which is bringing policy perspective on a holistic level. Well, let's see how it moves on. Now, another area which, in fact, Priyan hinted at, that is, see, assuming that science advice is a linear process where the science person gives advice and the policymaker accepts it, does not exist. I mean, we know it. Now, what's your take on that controversy of what Priyan was trying to highlight, when there are controversies between the scientists and when there are controversies between what the scientists are saying and with the policymakers? Karen?
Yeah, I would really like to pick up these points. I mean, they're great questions and comments. So I think, you know, for me, what sits at the heart of this is trust. So it's very important that the science advisors are not there in their own personal capacity. I am not there to lobby government. You know, I've decided while I'm on secondment, I have foregone the opportunity to apply for grant funding, for example, because then there's absolutely no risk of conflict of interest. I am governed by the Civil Service Code. I am a public servant, and I've gone through all the rigorous vetting processes and employment processes that are in place to make sure that our civil servants are, you know, of the highest caliber and are trusted by ministers and across their departments. So I think it's really important to put that in place to begin with. I think the wider challenge that we have as science advisors is helping our policy teams and our politicians to understand work at the frontiers of uncertainty. And so there is a sense that, you know, scientists know the absolute right answer and it's a yes or no. And I think what we've done is we've done a lot of education. in terms of helping our politicians and our civil service colleagues understand what we know when we know it, how confident we are with that knowledge, and what we're doing to learn more, and when we might know more. And I think that's really important, to bring the language of uncertainty into the science advice as we provide policy making. You know, it's not a failure to change our mind if we bring in new scientific evidence, and if that scientific evidence has been gathered in a highly robust way using the scientific method, and we can explain where that science advice comes from. I think that also helps us to deal with disagreement between scientists. Of course we disagree because we have a way to do that with the scientific method. We have a hypothesis, we design an experiment, we test it, and we move the frontiers of knowledge forward. I think what's not helpful is if ministers look and think that scientists are disagreeing or arguing because they have a vested interest. So again, transparency and trust is incredibly important. And all of this, of course, helps our parliamentarians to build the trust that they want to have with the voters and with the public, because ultimately we are spending public money. We are trying to ensure that our people are safe and our nations are prosperous and secure. And so the trust that the public has in scientists in the UK is high, and it's not something that we take for granted. And, you know, as you say, if you have various different bodies, each body will want to have an audience with government. And so there should be other mechanisms for that. Our universities, for example, are represented by an umbrella organisation called Universities UK. They will provide advice to universities, they will speak for universities, and that's right and proper that that body exists. There are many other types of bodies, but that's not the role of a chief scientific advisor. You know, I am not there in my capacity as a professor at the University of Bath, for example. I don't raise the University of Bath interests within my department because I'm there to harness the whole of the science and innovation ecosystem as a public servant. And I think, you know, going to Priyan's, your comment about, you know, health versus economy, again, I think this was one that the SAGE mechanism was incredibly powerful and influential and useful at bringing together these two. So we didn't have to do the scientists want to provide this advice, or does the economy want something different? What we did was we embedded the scientific method in all of that. One of the key issues that we saw, and particularly during our infection spread and our lockdown, was whether people would be compliant with the guidelines that we had issued, and ultimately sometimes the legal legislation to stay home and, for example, to self-isolate if they received a positive COVID test. And one of the things that we did was we actually did some research in the field to find out what people's attitudes were and intent was. And people really genuinely did have the intent to follow those guidelines. But what we discovered by doing that fundamental research was that some people didn't have the capacity to self-isolate, even if they had the intent to. And some of that was economic. And so what we were able to do is actually make sure that the science advice also sat in Treasury, and that helped the Chancellor design the right financial packages that had health and economy at the heart, so that we were able to protect businesses, we were able to help people, particularly with low family income, to be able to do the things that were right for preventing the spread of COVID. And so I think I was really impressed by that whole integrated system of science advice. We didn't set science against the economy, we didn't set science against politicians or policymakers. It was an integrated and complete response to the crisis that our nation and our people in the nation were facing, and then how that connected internationally. And we've continued to evolve that system, and where we found we've had a gap in knowledge or a gap in science advice, we've brought in more experts. And again, you know, providing those consensus statements, you can look at all of the publications that SAGE produce, and they're all published on the government website. You can see how the science advice is formed. You can see the level of confidence that the teams have when they provide their consensus statements, and you can see the challenge that's been put there. And you can see how that evolves with time as well, which again builds up trust with our politicians and with the public. And again, very important, for example, when we started to roll out vaccines, that we'd already built that very robust trust, that we built that transparency around how we publish data. Even when the news is bad, you have to be transparent with the data, and the public will then trust government if you say, we will tell you the truth, whether the situation is good or bad. And if the situation is bad, we'll tell you what we're doing to improve it. And I think that's been really, really interesting seeing that evolve over the last year and a half.
Yeah. So Carol, how is the system in the UK different from, let's say, Europe or Australia or US. Are you able to comment on this process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a growing number of countries that have chief scientific advisors, the equivalents of Sir Patrick Vallance in their countries. And in fact, there is an international network of government chief scientific advisors who meet on a regular basis and in fact have been working very closely through the COVID crisis. And, you know, what's very clear is that, you know, there's much appetite in countries around the world, if they don't already have these robust science mechanisms, to make sure that they start to put them in the heart of government, because they've seen how helpful and effective they are in the UK. And we've been, you know, providing that advice to many partners around the world like yourselves. I think also, you know, what's very clear is that through this crisis, different countries have taken different approaches. So some countries have taken a single expert health advisor. They've been very much sort of in the public eye. But as the crisis has rolled on, I mean, it's very clear that the pressure on an individual scientific expert to take the responsibility of advising government, you know, they can often go from hero to villain very quickly in the public press, depending on how the situation's going. That's actually a lot to ask somebody to take on. And my personal perspective is that I think the mechanism that we have in the UK has allowed our scientists to do incredible work, you know, working weekends and evenings. There's been a protection for them to be able to do that and have the challenge and have the disagreements and work through their methods to make sure that the answers that they're then providing to SAGE, you know, are robust. We've given them that space, and they've been doing this, you know, to be honest, in the glare of the public media, which is right and proper, but to give those teams that space to do that work at pace so that they can provide the best scientific evidence. Obviously, Sir Patrick Vallance and Professor Chris Whitty have been very much in the public eye. I think that wasn't a role that they expected when they took on their positions. They've been there on the daily briefings side by side with the Prime Minister, making sure that our journalists have direct access to those scientific advisors and experts so that they can ask their questions live and make sure that the pieces that they write are also informed by direct answers from the chief scientific advisors in government. And really, you know, I think the key there is that, again, they've built that trust, they've built that pedigree, and they're able to explain the thinking that is going on behind the policy making, that sometimes can be hard for citizens to understand, or citizens will be reading different things in different places. You know, we have a big challenge internationally with direct disinformation in social media, for example, and I know many countries are working together to try to tackle that, because that undermines that trust in science that helps our people be safe, and that disinformation is quite difficult to tackle, but we continue to try to address that.
Thank you very much. So when the COVID epidemic came in, presumably you all scrambled and brought in a different emergency structure, because the Sri Lankan structure seems to have been where they appointed a presidential task force. And that was a time when the parliament was not sitting. So the executive president had a bigger role to play. And the Presidential Task Force and National Operations Center to coordinate the implementation, etc., came in. So how did you all bring in the structure at an emergency or during an emergency? What's the sort of processes you have?
So I think we have quite an agile system, as I've said, because we have a robust standing structure. It means that we can respond agilely and quickly at the appropriate scale. When we do need to increase our access to experts, we can step that up fairly quickly. We have science advisory groups to each department, and so we already have those systems in place in non-emergency times. And obviously there will sometimes be emergencies that are department-based. So if there's, you know, a food health crisis, then it will be the Food Standards Agency will be dealing with that as part of their routine work. So everything is not at that cross-government crisis level normally, and it doesn't need to be. Different crises are handled in different ways. I think something of the order of magnitude of a global pandemic, I mean, this is unprecedented, you know, in our lifetime. So I should couch my language with that. But I think it was very clear that we were served well by those standing structures. When Sir Patrick pulled together the kinds of experts that he needed for the Science Advisory Group and emergencies for COVID, he already had all of those systems to draw on. He had public health systems to draw on. He could bring the leaders of the NHS together. He could bring the logistics experts. He had the agency I guess, and the reach to be able to do that, the authority to do that as the government chief scientific advisor, so that he was in the right place to be able to advise the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. So I think, that also, again, built that resilience, it built the trust in the process. The other things that we did, though, it was very clear that we needed to put in the right kind of science systems, and this was particularly in terms of data gathering. So we have the Office for National Statistics. They produce statistics on all sorts of different topics, but very early on in the process, we set up a survey. So it was clear that we didn't have the scale and capacity of the testing that we required to tackle the pandemic right at the beginning. And in fact, it was the publication by the Chinese colleagues of the whole genome, which helped teams around the world to be able to adapt assays to develop tests. So we were working very quickly in our government labs to do that at the beginning. But what we also realised was that if people were coming forward for testing with symptoms, that would create biased samples of data. So the Office for National Statistics put out a random survey out in the population, and we've been running that survey every week now and gathering those data throughout the pandemic. At the beginning, of course, it doesn't look like a very exciting survey, it doesn't have very much public profile, but now, of course, it's been incredibly important to give us an unbiased sample around the country, particularly as we started to realise that some people were asymptomatic. So this was a survey where we just contacted families randomly and said, we'd like to do weekly testing, and we'll see whether you're negative, we'll see whether you're positive. And we could then also integrate our genomic testing system within that. So that's given us, I guess, a research database that has also helped us to inform policy, and it hasn't been responsive in terms of testing to see whether there's an outbreak. That's a different kind of response. We also did a similar thing where we put testing into our national water system, because it was clear that we would be able to look at wastewater and be able to take tests from there. And again, putting in the data structures so that we are archiving and curating these data, because these will also be important for future research, looking back at the pandemic and learning for future pandemics. So making sure that we had very much a legacy response. So we were dealing with the crisis live, but we were also thinking in terms of that long-term value of these data for planning for future pandemics.
Thank you. So you mean to say when you want to get some data, you really reach out to the National Statistics Office and they do it for you? Or is it do you have a structure to do the research?
Both and. So the Office for National Statistics, the Chief Executive of the Office for National Statistics sits on SAGE. And so his teams are working in parallel. They're understanding the questions that we're trying to address within SAGE. And so they're an integral part of that process. We also have the genomics system, which was stood up, came from a COVID UK network. So this was led by Professor Sharon Peacock, who again is a leading academic who's also within government. And she pulled together 16 of our world leading genomics research groups around the country. And they then worked very hard to put the genomic screening system in place, which has been really important for us to identify new variants and emerging variants of concern quickly, so that we can start to put that into our policy response. So we've been drawing on the whole of our science and innovation ecosystem in a really novel way, I think. And where we've had the resource, we've pulled it together and coordinated so it has real impact. And where we've seen gaps, we've been able to put out real surveys in the field, for example, like the Office for National Statistics survey, or some of the behavioural surveys that our subcommittee within SAGE put in the field to understand people's behaviours. That was also very helpful for designing the response mechanisms, but also the public messaging that was required as we went through different waves of the pandemic.
Yeah, yes. Amira, any questions on the chat box or?
We seem to be experiencing a bit of a technical glitch. Unfortunately, the attendees for the meeting can't seem to join us. So we have informed them that they can join us live on Facebook. So most of them are watching us on Facebook.
All right.
So
okay.
Because of that, we're unable to take any questions from them.
All right. Okay. So let me, then we have one or two more, few exotic questions to ask.
You have some very interesting questions, Professor Jayasek.
Yeah, Carol, now this whole thing about post-normal science, not post-truth, but post-normal science, and how are you tackling that angle from your position?
I'd quite like to know the definition of that term.
All right, okay. Well, basically trying to say that the scientists do not have the monopoly of on knowledge. There is knowledge in the community, knowledge in the people who live through the experience, knowledge in the amongst the citizens. So, you know, we don't have this monopoly to say this is correct. Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I think of science advice as something you do with people rather than something you do to people. And I think the best science advice comes from a position of humility, but one has to put in place robust systems. And so when you're gathering evidence or data and developing insights, again, it comes with a scientific method. And that helps us to work past biases. You're absolutely right that lived experience is important. We've been putting a lot of effort into making sure that we're gathering as much information as possible, for example, on long COVID. So, post-COVID syndrome. And that's been very important to listen to patients' experiences, but make sure that, again, we're putting robust scientific studies in place. So that we're gathering evidence syntheses, we're making sure that clinicians who, for example, are doing brain scans or who are studying, multi-organ failure or impact of the virus, are connected up with our virologists and our scientists who understand, for example, how the virus connects to ACE2 receptors. I mean, it's making sure that it's drawing across the whole of that science ecosystem. So, I'd really like to step away from this idea as the all-powerful, all-knowledgeable scientist who comes forward with the right answer. That's not the kind of approach that I'm seeing with the scientists that I'm working with. It's very much the humility of trying to push forward the knowledge frontiers, understanding what we don't know, understanding what the right questions are to ask, and the right design studies to make sure that we get really robust answers that really moves our insight forward. If I can give you one example of this, we were trying to understand the nature of the COVID outbreak within the UK. So at the beginning of the pandemic, obviously we had no COVID in the country. We were doing epidemiological modelling based on the information that we had, based on what we knew in other countries. And we were trying to make sure that we were, putting processes in place to protect our vulnerable people and to protect the NHS. And what was very clear was that the pandemic took off very, very quickly. And it was very difficult to understand. I think many countries were struggling with this, what the nature of the spread was and whether we had super spreader outbreaks, how the virus was being transmitted. And what was really insightful was the genomics work. And so when we actually gene sequenced, we realized that the virus was seeded across the whole of the UK in the space of just 2 or 3 days in February, early March. And this was really 75% of those genomic lines were imported from travel between our nearest European neighbours in France, Spain and Italy. And so suddenly we had new data that gave us a deep insight into the dynamics of that virus in terms of how it was transmitted by people movements. And that again helped us to look at some of the measures that we had to put in place. And I think that insight didn't come live at the time. It came, some weeks and months later as we gathered the data and we started to analyse them. But that was critically important. So we didn't end up in this speculative zone where people were expressing opinions and instincts as to how the virus was spreading. We really needed those new data to come in and give us new insights. So we're always looking for new ways of opening up the right kinds of questions and opening up new ways to answer those questions.
Thank you, Carol. Now, there is a question coming up from Professor Sirimali Fernando. She was the former chairperson of the National Science Foundation and also of the Coordinating Secretariat for Science, Technology and Innovation. And now she's in the NASTEC, probably the closest we can have for a science advisor. Sirimali, over to you.
Thanks. I don't know whether you can hear me.
Yes,
Saroj,
yes,
I'm having I couldn't get into through the link. I'm using Shami's link.
Yeah.
First of all, I should thank Professor Carol and you for this excellent webinar, because I think this is very timely. We need it. And also at a time that NASTEC is trying to put in a structure, a much needed structure for government science advice. Having said that, I'm very grateful to Professor Carol. We have a lot to learn from you. And I was particularly interested of how you really collect and manage data during an emergency, which we haven't thought of at NASDAQ, and I think that is very important. But I just want to ask you, how do you, as SAGE, you collect the data, and how do you, do you work with the Department of Health, or how does it work? Or do you work independently? How do you integrate with the health the department? How does it work? Because I'm sure they must be doing quite a lot of work there too.
So just to clarify, the Department of Health are represented on SAGE, so we have members of all government departments there, and we have the right experts. So we started to develop an opportunity for some of the public health genomics teams to come into SAGE. Sometimes people will come on an issue base, so there may be something on the agenda and the person working on that will come and present, and there will be a discussion within SAGE. Sometimes there'll be standing members. It will depend on obviously people's bandwidth for that work. We've now evolved, I think, SAGE to quite a stable situation, because obviously we need the Science Advisory Government and Emergency mechanism for other emergencies and crises that may arise. Normally it's stood up, the science advice is formed, it goes into policy teams, and it's stood back down again. So the COVID crisis has been unusual in that we've continued to have SAGE COVID, if you like, running and growing and developing. So all of those experts are on SAGE, be they operational, be they hospital-based, and be they genomics, and maybe out in the community for the public health advice. So we've made sure that we've got all of that integrated. And I think that's really the strength of that mechanism, that we have so many different people working in different operational ways. They will also be drawing on their own systems. So for example, we have a daily situation report from the NHS dashboards, our National Health Service dashboards, coming into SAGE, so that we can understand, as we were going through the peak of one of the waves, whether the NHS was still had capacity, and making sure that all of the right science advice was going in there. And we were then able to nuance our public messaging and our public responses as we were reaching, closer to a crisis point, and make sure that we didn't completely swamp the NHS and overwhelm it. And so I think, it's really important to make sure that everybody understands this is not a health crisis or a logistics crisis. It's actually a whole society response. And that also includes my department, that internationally, of course, we've been working in the multilateral system around vaccine funding and distribution, because it's an international crisis as well. Supply chains, we've been working with partners around the world. It's not possible to do this in a compartmentalized, departmental way, because it's so integrated.
Thank you very much. I think time is catching up. We have 2 minutes more. Aruna, would you mind taking on the proceedings now?
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, so can I ask Carol now, in her international linkages, I think this question was asked earlier also. Is it mostly the sort of so-called Western or developed countries that have this science advice and network? Do you see it in more developing and poorer countries like ours? And if we were to set about creating that kind of system, would you start with a single chief scientific advisor, or would you try to build it more from the bottom up? Just some thoughts on that. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. We've been working with, a whole range of countries around the world. I think Rwanda is possibly the newest country that is looking at having a chief scientific advisor. I think it's a great network. We also have a foreign ministry network of chief scientific advisors that Sir Peter Gluckman put in place when he was government chief scientific advisor in New Zealand. So I think there is that growing infrastructure and departments around the world. Foreign ministries, for example, are very keen to set up a science advisor and have them join that mechanism. I think, from what I've heard today, you already have so many strong pieces of the jigsaw in place. And so you need that coordinating function. I think, it might be helpful to have that conversation within government and understand, maybe where the needs lie, where your parliamentarians and your leaders feel they're most vulnerable. It might be a difficult conversation to have. It needs to be a conversation that's opened up in a safe space where it doesn't look like scientists lobbying for funding, for example. That has to be a totally separate issue. It's very much about public service and helping the nation. I think it has been really valuable to have Sir Patrick. You know, he's a world-leading scientist, he's a clinician, he's worked in, you know, a major international corporation, and he's then come into government to be that public servant. So I think, you know, he's a very trusted interlocutor. You know, he's also very dynamic, and he has the capacity to pull people together and mobilize people, and he has the authority to do that. So I think that's important, because you need somebody who can mobilize that. And also, when you're dealing with a crisis and an emergency, you're putting this structure in place for the future. But you also want to be able to have the impact now as you tackle this ongoing pandemic. I think bottom up, you already have so many pieces. You have your funding agencies, you have your departments. So maybe something like a government chief scientific advisor who can then, you know, with some resource, to design the team that they need around them to be able to deliver to those government objectives and help the country to tackle this crisis and future issues, but also to look at those longer term strategic issues. Because you're right when you talk about the economy, that we will need a post-COVID recovery. And so that will also draw on your entire science and innovation ecosystem that will not necessarily, it may be health related, it may be technology related, but, you know, all of those pieces need to come together. So, for example, climate change and a green recovery is something that we're focusing on very much in the UK. Dealing with the pandemic is one piece of that wider landscape. So certainly somebody with, I think, the resource and the agency to pull together all of these really strong pieces of the jigsaw that you already have in place, you know, would be one way to look at it.
Thank you very much. Amira, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much to both of you. Let me first apologize to our attendees who are unable to join us. Technology, you know, bane of our existence. We apologize from Pathfinder Foundation, but we hope, I saw most of them were logged on Facebook. So we hope you got the most of the conversation. It will anyway be available on Facebook, the entire recording, as well as on our Twitter, all other social platforms. To Professor Jai Singh and Professor Mandel, thank you very much for being here. It was a very interesting discussion. To the British High Commission in Colombo, thank you for putting us in touch with Professor Mandel's office and all her staff who assisted us. And also for our Sri Lankan experts who joined us and gave comments. We appreciate your presence, especially at a time like today where there's so much happening in Colombo. Thank you all. Pathfinder intends to continue this discussion at varying periods of time. Thank you for all your assistance, and thank you for being here. I hope you all learned something from this. So take care. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Pleasure meeting you.
You too. Good luck. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.